Today's mini lesson is on conclusions, writing good conclusions for any essay that we complete. Our LEQ is how do I write an effective conclusion. Today's mini lesson will kind of go over some important parts to include in a conclusion, and we'll look at some examples. There are two big important pieces. The first one is that you need to remember in the beginning of your essay, you need to restate your thesis. It's kind of opposite of the introduction. In the introduction, we started with some generic information about the book and then got a little bit more specific with our thesis. In our conclusion, we do the opposite. We start really specifically with a restatement of our thesis, but you need to do it in a new way. It should not look the same as it does in your introduction. And then we get a little bit more general about the book and our world that we live in. And that part, the second part after you restate your thesis, is the so what. What new insights can you share about things that your characters have learned, or even things about or things that can be applied to the world that we live in. So let's take a look at our thesis from the Father Juilliard essay that we looked at before we started writing at the beginning of this unit. Here is the thesis that was in the introduction. Despite being caring and perceptive, Father Juilliard's naive and trusting nature proved to be his ultimate downfall. Word for word, directly from the introduction, is our thesis. In our conclusion, as I mentioned previously, you need to reword the thesis in a new way, but it needs to contain the same information. So here's the reworded thesis. By the end of the novel, Father Juilliard, the compassionate and perceptive father figure in Trash, loses his naive outlook on life after his adventure with the three garbage dump boys. So we have the compassionate, which is the caring. We have the perceptive, and we also talk about him being naive down here at the bottom as well as at the top. Same information, just reworded a little differently. Exactly what you need to do. Your thesis and your intro should not be exactly the same or worded exactly the same as it is in your conclusion. The second part that we talked about in the beginning of this mini lesson was that you needed to include, after your reworded thesis, you needed to include kind of the bigger picture. What does your character kind of understand about the story, or about what happened in the story that perhaps he or she didn't as she was going through it, or he was going through it. So here's one for Father Juilliard. After everything that he's experienced, here's what he's kind of gained from all of that. Father Juilliard recognizes that the boys, destined to a life of picking through stuppa, can gain nothing from his so-called education in the face of such conditions. Despite knowing that, Father Juilliard constantly sacrifices himself and unknowingly his job to help these boys find a bright future. So he didn't know that as he was going through all of those experiences with the boys, but now that he's been through it all, this is kind of some new insight that he's gained on his experiences with the boys. So that's kind of the beginning of that so what that you need to include in your thesis. The last part really gets to the so what. What impact did your character have? What has he learned perhaps about the world that he's living in? And this is what we've come up with. Little does he know that his presence in their lives, coupled with their clever plans and unwavering determination, will lead them to a better life in San Paulo. So despite everything that he tried, he feels like he perhaps has failed, but he will never know the impact that he has, because it did eventually lead them to a life in San Paulo. That wasn't his intention. He wanted them to have the better education so they could get out, but instead the other things that he did helped them to get out of San Paulo. So you kind of have those three pieces in your conclusion. So let's take a look at it kind of all together. The red part at the top is the reworded version of the thesis from the introduction. The black part in the middle is kind of that big picture, what Father Juilliard has begun to understand after he's experienced all of these things. It could be an understanding or an insight that he's gained about the experiences he's had, about himself, about the world that he lives in. Any of those things will work to kind of start getting towards that so what. This is kind of the big picture. And then the yellow part at the bottom really gets to the so what. Why are we sharing all of this information? Why is it important? Which is ultimately what you want to end with. Your readers want to know why you've taken the time out of their day and asked them to read this essay. So you really need to leave them with a so what. Here's just some ideas for your so what's that are going to go at the end of your introduction. What does this boy teach the reader? So whichever character you've chosen, what does he teach the reader? How will the boy live differently moving forward? How is his life better because of the experiences that he has had? And how has he positively impacted others? So those are just some thoughts to kind of get you thinking about what some possible so what's will be that you could include in the end of your. So at this point, you need to open up your reading and writing notebooks and start working on composing a successful concluding paragraph for your trash final reflection.